Is it all over? Now, after the nightmare we've lived through, that might seem like a pretty presumptuous question to start a show with, but the data in the UK, at least, is looking really, really positive. We've started to reopen society. Cases of COVID-19 are not going up. So yes, it's, the overall story of COVID-19 at the moment, not a positive one. You look around the world, appalling. That's because we're not distributing vaccines well enough. But if you look at this country, and if we get vaccines everywhere, this will be the situation for everyone. It looks like the vaccines may be liberating us from COVID-19. That's the topic we'll be discussing for the first part of tonight's show. I'm joined, of course, by Aaron Bastani. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm very well, Michael. Thank you so much for having me on Friday.
Well, is that that's a Clapton FC shirt, isn't it, that you've got on tonight?
That is, yeah.
The future of football.
Could be. That's a big debate we're going to have over the next 12 months. Could be.
Yeah. Not a debate we're going to have on tonight's show, but we do have some other great topics for you. We are going to be looking at the run-up to the local elections. So the issues that Labour are running on to try and, I suppose, get some momentum back in the run-up to those elections. I'll also be speaking to Ross Greer, MSP for the Greens, about the most exciting elections, which are happening next week for the Scottish Parliament. Later on in the show, I speak to Paul Mason on Jon Snow leaving Channel 4 News. Of course, Paul worked at Channel 4 News for 3 years with Jon, and we're going to cover the latest in the ongoing outrage, which is the revolving door, not between Britain and lobbying, which has been what's dominated the news for, I suppose, the past few weeks, but the revolving door, much less discussed, probably because it involves journalists, between politics and the media industry. Now, as always, we love hearing your comments, so do get in touch by tweeting us on the hashtag Tysky Sour or send us your super chats. We do really enjoy them and appreciate them. First story. After schools reopened in March and after shops and outdoor hospitality reopened earlier this month, there were many concerns, reasonable concerns, that we could see new spikes of COVID-19 across the UK. However, those fears as of yet have not been borne out in the statistics. The Office for National Statistics today released their infection survey, an estimate that 1 in 1,010 people in England currently have COVID-19. Now, the ONS data is, we've talked about this a lot, is based on a random and representative sample, so catches both symptomatic and asymptomatic cases. It's considered the gold standard. To take you through the other nations of the UK, in Wales, 1 in 1,570 people, they are estimating currently test positive for COVID-19. In Scotland, it's 1 in 640, and in Northern Ireland, it's 1 in 940 people. Now, alongside that data from the ONS, we've also had some positive data from the Zoe COVID app. Now, this is the app. Some of you might use it. You can put in any symptoms you have that day, and they have been tracking prevalence of COVID-19 and also working out what the different symptoms are throughout this whole epidemic in this country. Now, they, at this point in time, currently estimate that only 1 in 3,551 people in the UK currently have symptomatic COVID-19. And today, Tim Spector, who's the epidemiologist who runs the app, told Sky that Britain may in fact be past the pandemic period.
It looks like at the moment we're past that pandemic period, and we're moving into what we call the endemic period, where we get low levels of infection and occasional outbreaks, but they don't spread to the rest of the population, and the general risk is low. Really, people, particularly if they've been vaccinated, should be much more relaxed and less stressed out. And I know a lot of people are still very worried about coming out of doors or pubs opening or restaurants, etc. But for me, this is a very reassuring picture, and we should be a bit more upbeat about it and focusing on the good news, not just the bad news or the possibility of something bad happening in the future.
He's saying there's a reassuring picture from the data he's looking at. I think many people will find listening to him speaking there fairly reassuring. Let's return to the ONS statistics, because these are, as I say, considered the gold standard, incredibly reliable, representative sample, and they've been using the same method for months now. So the data released today. They come out every Friday, and this runs to the 24th of April and shows COVID rates are falling in almost every region of England. I'm just going to show you the English regions at this point in time. So you can see in Yorkshire, in the Humber, that's the only place where it seems like they could possibly be rising, but only very slightly. They might not even be rising. Everywhere else, it looks as if cases are falling, and you can see prevalence is really low in lots of places. So the height is 0.2% in Yorkshire and the Humber, and in the southwest, 0.0% of people have COVID-19. Now, presumably that doesn't mean there are literally 0 people with COVID-19, but it must mean that there are less than 0.05% of people with COVID-19, because they've rounded down to that. So that's, I mean, obviously, it goes without saying, very, very positive. The ONS also give us a breakdown when it comes to age. And again, here you can see it is falling in every age group. So there was a big worry that when schools reopened, you'd see significant breakouts in schools. Again, reasonable fears. These were not silly ideas that this might happen, but it doesn't, again, seem to be borne out in the statistics so much. So you can see that COVID is falling among every age group. School years 7 to 11, 0.3%. In primary school, 0.2% currently have COVID-19. Remember, at the peak, those age groups were between 2 and 3% of school children testing positive for COVID-19. So again, all looking very positive. So what is going on here? Now, it's been said a lot, absolutely true, that the big drop we saw at the start of this year, that was because of the lockdown. That was because we had one of the strictest, longest lockdowns in the whole world, in fact. We had that because we needed it, and we needed it because Boris Johnson twiddled his thumbs for such a long time while COVID was spreading out of control at the end of December. But the more recent phenomenon of lockdown starting to loosen and cases not increasing, that seems to be basically down to the vaccines. And again, we can show you some more ONS statistics. This is from a different release. This was from Wednesday, and it shows us the levels of antibodies which are currently in the adult population in the nations of the UK. So you can see here the dark blue line is the percentage of adults testing positive for COVID antibodies. So if we just look at England there in the top left, you can see that goes from the 13th of December from around 15%. It's been going up steadily, and it is now at 68.3% of adults in England at the date that this was done. I think this is up to the 16th of April, had COVID antibodies. So that will actually be higher now, because obviously the vaccine rollout has been continuing apace. You're looking at a similar situation in all the nations of the UK. Now, of course, this is not a time for absolute complacency, even if it is a time for positivity, because you can see from that there's still 30% of adults without antibodies, and young people children, people who are under 18 aren't included in this data. So we presume, unless they've all had COVID-19, more of them have had COVID-19, but they all haven't had COVID-19, we presume antibody levels will be lower among them. And even when it comes to adults, even if you've got 30% of people who don't have antibodies, if you imagine, super spreader events where everyone is from a young age group, say if they open nightclubs tomorrow, you can imagine there being some quite severe outbreaks, because you're putting a lot of people in the same place, not many of them vaccinated. That's why we shouldn't open nightclubs tomorrow. We could quite soon, though, be at a situation where almost everyone is vaccinated, because despite concerns that younger age groups would not want to take the jab, again, that's not borne out in the data. Let's look at this again from the ONS about positivity when it comes to the vaccine. So this is showing us that among all age groups, positivity about taking the vaccine has increased since the start of that vaccine rollout, and it stayed very, very high, even among those young age groups, right to the present day. And most positively from this, it doesn't seem like the changing advice with the AstraZeneca vaccine has affected in any way people's willingness to take the vaccine. Aaron, I want to throw to you. I think you can potentially hear a washing machine in the background, which I should go and pause. But while I am doing that, it is all looking pretty rosy, isn't it?
Rosy, is that the word? Because obviously there is a context here, sort of internationally, which is terrible. Globally, we know that COVID-19 figures are still going up, that there are huge problems in the global south. India in particular, I mean, people are hearing the horror stories. I probably don't need to recount them, which isn't just people dying from COVID-19, but also from a lack of oxygen, or formerly on the death certificate, it might say COVID-19, but these are eminently preventable deaths. Elsewhere, there have been issues around infrastructure. I believe there was a major mishap that happened in a hospital recently. And so there isn't really the infrastructure at the best of times in a number of places across India. You're hearing terrible stories from the major cities, so we don't really know what it's like in, say, smaller villages. And that's not just sort of, me just saying this. That's the kind of high quality reporting you're hearing on the World Service. And they would say, really, we don't have the best of data available yet from what's happening beyond the major cities in India. However, in Britain, and this does have implications to the global south, because I think for Britain and for Israel, not including the occupied territories, what you're seeing is these vaccines work, which is to say, once you go past the critical mass, right now, like you say, Michael, I think something like 70% of the UK have antibodies. That, of course, will go down if we don't vaccinate people continually. It will go down after people there's a period after which they stop producing those antibodies once they've had the virus. It's not going to stay there permanently, but what it tells us is there are conditions which we can maintain, which will allow us to stay where we are. And there are going to have to be trade-offs. When we're saying at the top of this show, is it all over? That doesn't mean we're going to open the nightclubs again. But what it does mean is we can continue to unlock, and I think we're going to have to think about big things over the next 6 months, a year, which we probably can't do. There are probably a bunch of countries we're not going to be able to go to for 6 months unless it's hugely pressing. There are probably going to be restrictions in some circumstances on internal travel where there's a major breakout, although the statistical likelihood of that, of course, diminishes with time. The longer this successful vaccination effort happens. So, I mean, it kind of is all over, it seems, famous last words. But in terms of seeing something like what we saw over the Christmas period, I mean, that doesn't seem plausible now. We might get another spike. But again, I don't even see how we'll get another spike, Michael. And, people who've been watching the show regularly know that we've been very skeptical. I think you've been one of the best informed people on COVID in the country. If I have any COVID-related questions, I come to you. And I think even you, Michael, with the reopening of schools, with the reopening of course, non-essential retail, like I said, there's been no uptick whatsoever. You look at the data coming out of Israel, it would suggest that actually we can defeat this, not easily, because of course rolling out a vaccine en masse, tens of millions of people is actually an unprecedented effort of collective action globally, but we know what to do. And in a way, maybe that does bode well for the global south, because at least we know now what's replicable in places like India, in Brazil, and elsewhere. Of course, there will be other countries in the global south with, not the best healthcare infrastructure systems, possible. So I think it is good news, because we know, it seems, we know how to beat this. Now, of course, there may be new variants. Some strange stuff may happen, but it seems we know how to beat this. And I'm gonna sort of kick the ball to you, Michael, because like I say, you're Mr. COVID-19. What do you think? What's the Michael Walker declaration on this?
I should say, actually, because one thing I should clarify, there was actually a bit of an uptick in primary and secondary schools after they reopened, but it is now declining, just like among all other age groups. So that was probably because of a tipping point. And when it came to vaccines, I mean, that's the story, essentially. Unless you're having huge gatherings of people who are unvaccinated, then it's much harder for for COVID-19 to travel through the population. We know that these vaccines are very good at suppressing transmission. That was one thing we didn't know at the start of the year. That really changes our ability to assume that the vaccines can essentially get us out of this. Again, all of this is to say, let's take this slow, because if we say, oh, everything looks fine, let's completely go back to normal, unknowns can emerge. As you say, we could get new variants which are completely escape the vaccine. At this point in time, it looks like there are many variants, in fact, which the vaccine are less effective against, but most of the vaccines are still somewhat effective against them. And we potentially think, again, we need to know a bit more about this. Potentially, all the vaccines are quite good at stopping serious illness with the variants. So I don't think a variant is going to come along which sort of takes us back to square one. So as long as we're keeping an eye on this, as long as we're being relatively careful, it looks like we are definitely out of the thick of it, and we can probably have quite a pleasant summer. For balance, someone who said something different today on Sky News. So this is someone who doesn't think the pandemic's over, even in Europe and North America. This is David Nabarro, special envoy for COVID-19 for the World Health Organization. He said to Sky News that the pandemic is not nearly over. So he said, secondly, I just want to stress that actually the virus could well surge back into Europe and into North America. It may not cause such widespread suffering because of the increasing number of people who've been immunized, but don't imagine that somehow the pandemic is over in Europe and the US. It's not. Now, his main emphasis in that interview, understandably because he's from the World Health Organization, is to say that, look, this pandemic on a global level, 100% not over. We would never, ever suggest that it was remotely over, as we talked about on last Friday's show. In much of the world, the pandemic is worse than it has ever been. But here, you know, I'm not exactly sure why David Nabarro doesn't think it's almost over. The US has similar vaccination levels to us, or in the UK. I think actually maybe I'm a bit more positive than him about that. I mean, I potentially, from the perspective of the World Health Organization, what they don't want is people to get complacent, especially people in the rich world to get complacent, because their whole point is to say, let's not treat this as over until it's over for everyone. I agree with that ethically, but in terms of the epidemiology of it, you know, it is looking positive here. Aaron, I want to throw to you on that point. Why do you think there is this sort of difference? Where do you see the negativity coming from? I don't want to say, he's being he's being unnecessarily negative. So, do you see the argument that actually we're not out of this, that it could all go horribly wrong at some point in time, and so we should be encouraging the government to be, I suppose, taking a zero COVID strategy would be what Independent Sage and people like that are talking about. Do you think there's any argument now for going for zero COVID or something like that?
Well, I think zero COVID should be taken seriously as a strategy for future outbreaks, whether it's a new variant of this or whether it's a different virus. The reason why countries in East Asia had zero COVID was because, of course, they had the SARS pandemic at the epidemic, or maybe pandemic, technically, at the beginning of the 21st century. And so this approach to pandemics, we will have to use it again because we're going to see more and more of these things because of climate change, because of deforestation, because of global, supply chains and encroaching on, previously, wilderness. So we're going to see much more of these. So I think that debate around zero COVID, I think just our general pandemic response has to look like that, whether it's a new variant or whether it's a new virus, whether it's a new pathogen, etc. I think the reason why somebody would be negative, given what we know, which isn't, a different pathogen, would be effectively a cognitive bias. I mean, that may sound very rich coming from me speaking about a very esteemed scientist, but I think given the experience of the last 12 months, given how terrible everything's been, it's actually very reasonable to be hugely risk averse. Now, it's one thing to be reasonable. It's another thing to be correct or rational, let's say. Statistically speaking, the probabilities of what he's talking about, they seem to be quite low. Of course, it could happen. And given, all the manifest things we didn't, foresee 2 years ago, what's happened since, a global economic downturn, 500,000 people have died in the US, more than 200,000 people have died in India, more than 500,000 people have died in the major European countries. Yeah, of course, that should make people very risk averse. So I think what he's saying is explicable, but given the data we're seeing coming out of Israel, coming out of the UK, I don't think it's necessarily correct. But again, that may sound strange. We're not medical health professionals, but as journalists, we're here to digest the information. And like you say, the vaccines, they're not just great at stopping transmission. They're also very, very good at dealing with serious disease, regardless of which variant you get. We could have a terrible scenario where we have the Brazil variant maybe run wild in the UK, because of course that can be deadly to younger people. It's killed many babies, for instance, in Brazil. Of course, those people aren't vaccinated because the variants we've had so far, those are the least at risk people. With the Brazilian variant, they would be more at risk. But other than that, I can't really foresee many circumstances where something truly terrible happens, where we have another experience like what we've just gone through. And I think, again, talking about cognitive biases, all of your assumptions are kind of gazumped by an experience like the one we just had, and I think that's flattened people's expectations, their capacity for making, rational predictions. And I think this is one example of that.
I do tend towards agreeing with you. As I say, I'm going to keep a relatively open mind. I think it's good to have humility on these questions. But for me, it does seem like, these vaccines really are doing the job. I was going to say I'd be happy to prove wrong, but this is one where I really wouldn't be happy to be proved wrong. I really hope I'm right on this one. Let's look at a couple more sort of chunks, nuggets of information that we got from the ONS this week. These are very interesting. One of them is on, I suppose, the effects of COVID-19, which will last beyond the pandemic. This is a pretty striking statistic, actually. So the ONS have looked into percentages of people who self-report to having long COVID in different parts of the UK, and they've found that people in the most deprived areas of the country are more than 50% more likely to have suffered from long COVID. So 2.2% of people in the most deprived areas report suffering from long COVID, 1.4% in the least deprived areas. Long COVID is something which can last a very long time. This could be something that we're living with for, well, I mean, we don't know. We could be living with it for months because ultimately the vaccine gets rid of it, or we could be living with it for years because it does long-term damage that the vaccine can't handle. So that could be something that really compounds inequality in this country. Obviously, an especially striking statistic, because one of the risk factors for getting long COVID seems to be if you have no chance to rest. So one, people in the most deprived areas are more likely to get COVID-19 because of housing situations and because of frontline jobs. Two, if you get COVID-19 and you're in one of the most deprived areas, it's less likely that you are able to rest properly if you catch the virus. If you don't rest when you've got it, you're more likely to get post-viral fatigue. So I think one of those issues where COVID really brings out the striking contrasts in this country between life chances in rich parts of the country and poor parts of the country. One more statistic I'm going to show you concerns unemployment, and especially the unequal effect this has had on people based on their age group. So unemployment for recent graduates and 18 to 24-year-olds has reached its highest peak in 4 years. As you can see there, 18 to 24-year-olds and recent graduates, that's a real jump since before the pandemic. Currently, 12% of recent graduates are unemployed and 14% of 18 to 24-year-olds. It's been a bit of an uptick in unemployment, but not massive. And presumably this is in large part because, if you're a recent graduate, you were quite unlikely to have been furloughed. So you end up just relying on universal credit. Aaron, I want to go to you, I suppose, specifically on this unemployment question. I've been thinking a lot, well, lately, for obvious reasons, because we've seen some of them around the country, whether this summer is going to be one, a real hotbed, actually, of sort of protest and political unrest. And, what, partly because people have been pent up during the pandemic, but one of the big correlations between sort of big protest movements is youth unemployment, isn't it? So this could really translate into quite a fiery political dynamic in this country.
I mean, we've already seen it, Michael. You saw it with the anti-Super League protests almost immediately, which popped up 10 days ago, whatever it was. You saw outside Chelsea, Peter Cech with the team bus remonstrating with fans who were blocking it from going into Stamford Bridge. And we saw at Chelsea, so in West London, in Arsenal, North London, people were burning American flags. So you look at that, you look at BLM. You look at the climate stuff, potentially return of the climate strikers, XR. I think there's also a huge space for, obviously continued right-wing protests. I think actually a lot of the anti-vax stuff, we saw a huge anti-vax protest, I think, last weekend. I don't think that's necessarily left or right. I think and also what struck me, I don't know about you, Michael, but that was actually far more mixed in terms of its composition, its age, racial sort of composition and so on, far more mixed than I think people would have anticipated. Certainly I would have anticipated. So I think you're looking at just a panoply of protest movements probably emerging over the next 6 months. And they won't all be good. You won't agree with all of them. You might think some of them are very strange. You might vehemently disagree with some of them. But I think, the people that have to deal with public order in this country, so I'm talking about, the Home Office, the Home Secretary, the Metropolitan Police Service, and of course, the highest levels of government too. I think they are predicting public order of some kind. Could be peaceful protest, could be all the way through to something a lot more antagonistic. Of course, I'm not talking about Northern Ireland. It's a separate situation. But again, I think because of the factors we're talking about here relating to COVID, but then, of course, their own unique political context too, could get very antagonistic there as well. So I think we're going to see the most protest we've seen in Britain probably since 2011. 2011, of course, was an incredible year for protest. Coming just a year after the coalition government came in, you had March 26th, TUC demo, you had the student movement at the end of 2010. You had, of course, the 2011 August riots. You had just protests constantly popping off. And again, they weren't all from the left. That's when we begin to see the EDL sort of form into a pretty solid street movement. And you see sort of elements of the far right taking to the streets with the sort of collapse of the BNP after 2012, 2013. So I think we're going to see lots and lots of protests. But it's important to remember for the left, not all protest is good, but they're coming, I think, yeah.
Will be a very interesting summer, I think. Let's go to what you guys think. We've talked about, our assessment of what we've got in store when it comes to this epidemic. We also asked you before we went live in our YouTube community what you thought. So we asked you the slightly leading question, but factual. With new ONS data showing COVID-19 case levels 20 times lower than their January peak, are we finally seeing the end of the UK pandemic? That's the question we asked you. 38% said yes, 30% said no, and 32% said don't know. So that's, to be honest, as close to an even split as you're probably going to get in a poll like that. So a divided audience. We'll see how this one pans out. We're going to move on to the local elections now. A couple of comments first. Jamie Bird with a $5 says, happy birthday to Law Bird. Novara Media keeps us politically sane. Happy birthday, Law Bird. Very glad to keep you politically sane. I hope, maybe you keep each other emotionally sane. Ala H with a $5 says, love Aaron's shirt, big up the Tons and all East London anti-fascists. I suppose I was going to say, I don't know if there's, presumably people can't go and watch Clapton now because of the lockdown. I don't know, maybe it will start up again after that. And Joshua Youngerman with $3 says, but Joe Rogan said that if I'm young and healthy, I presume that was going to say, don't bother taking the vaccine. He did, which we discussed on Wednesday's show. We're going to mention briefly at the end of tonight's show as well. Now, next Thursday, elections will take place in every region of the UK other than Northern Ireland. In Scotland and Wales, there are elections to their respective national parliaments. In many of England's cities and regions, there are mayoral elections, and there are also council elections in much of England. On top of that, there's a by-election in Hartlepool. That's following the resignation of the incumbent Labour MP. Now, in the elections across England, at least, most media attention is focused on how Labour under Starmer will fare, given it will be his first big electoral test. And the other big question is, amid a successful vaccine rollout, will the Tories be able to, I suppose, drown out any complaints that people have about Boris Johnson's flat? Now, it's that latter issue, Boris Johnson's flat, that Labour are really trying to emphasise in the run-up to those elections. And to that end, this was Angela Rayner speaking to the issue while out campaigning.
Well, I think that's a disgusting thing to say, actually, when you won't just say who's paid for his flat and where this money has come from. The general public need to know that, there's standards and rules in place because in the 90s we had cash for questions, and people who give you thousands of pounds to do up your flat generally tend to expect something in return. So what's Boris Johnson hiding? Why won't he just tell people where this money came from?
The other element of the flat story that Labour are running with, as well as where the money came from, is the tastes of Carrie Simons and Boris Johnson and whether it's a bit snobbish. This particularly relates to Carrie Simons telling Tatler that the flat they inherited from Theresa May was a John Lewis nightmare. Now, Keir Starmer, playing off this and to highlight his more positive attitude towards a department store, Starmer has posed looking for wallpaper in a John Lewis store. Now, the stunt potentially backfired. He was attacked by the right-wing press for it, at least. The Daily Mail went with the jokes on you, Sir Keir. And they say his job is to hold ministers to account. And 2 days ago, he savaged the PM for leaving meetings to pick wallpaper. So when Labour's leaders staged a woeful photo stunt at a John Lewis DIY counter, the response was universal. And then, the joke's on you, Sir Keir Starmer. Now, the Daily Mail attacking the Labour leader is not particularly surprising. I imagine this visit to John Lewis will have absolutely zero effect whatsoever on how people vote next week, but it's worth pointing out nonetheless. Aaron, I want to go to you on this issue. We'll look at polls in a moment, but first of all, do you think this issue about the flat is something which Labour are right to sort of really go heavily on?
Nobody cares. Nobody cares, Michael. Nobody cares. And I can see the exact same people on Twitter who said that, there was a sudden emergent mass that wanted to cancel Brexit. The exact same people, again, are treating politics like a true crime podcast with Sir Keir Starmer as the protagonist detective. That's not what politics is. People don't care. Their lives are far more interesting to them than following politics like a hobby or like something on iTunes or Spotify. They want to know what you're going to do for them. And the last thing government did for them, actually, was roll out one of the most successful vaccination programs in the country. So that in the world, rather. So that counts for a lot more than wallpaper and John Lewis. And I thought when Boris Johnson was sort of rebutting this in Prime Minister's questions last week, actually on Wednesday, sorry, and he called it bizarre that this was the focus of Labour's attack, I kind of agreed. Because you think 120,000 people have died. We've seen a huge economic downturn. Joe Biden has just hosted this climate summit where we've seen astonishing, they're just promises, they're just words, right? But astonishing promises from Japan, from Britain, from Canada, from the US about reducing CO2 emissions. And the leader of the Labour Party is talking about wallpaper from John Lewis. And I think it's kind of ridiculous. And it's the kind of thing that Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't have done. And it was one of those things, people nail Jeremy Corbyn for the things he didn't do, which he should have done. He was very right to not touch this stuff. He would have said, it's not politics. I don't care. I really don't care about wallpaper. And you know what? Most people don't care about wallpaper. I really couldn't care less. And when you've got people like Laura Koonsberg on sort of, you listen to BBC Sounds, it might be The World at 1, it might be PM, it might be 6 o'clock news, and she says, this matters, and here's why. The minute you hear that sentence, you go, this doesn't matter, because literally nobody cares. With Dominic Cummings, people cared because you're being told you can't do certain things, and yet this guy at the top of government's done exactly what the rest of you are told you're not allowed to do. It's hypocrisy, right? But the idea that the Prime Minister takes money to have a bit of a flash redesign of number 10, really? Is that news? Okay. Move on. And that's for the people that hear about it. And the thing that annoys me the most is you get the coverage of the coverage. You get the spin on the spin, and you have people go, is it the story is no longer even the wallpaper? Is the wallpaper cutting through to the electorate? And I'm thinking to myself, the first story wasn't interesting. The second one certainly isn't. I really don't care if wallpaper is cutting through to the electorate or not. What the hell are you talking about? Like you say, we've got really high youth unemployment at the moment. We've got a housing crisis. We've got people that, are really bruised psychologically, economically from the last 12 months. And we're talking about whether or not wallpaper's cutting through to the red wall. And I'll finish with this, Michael. The media sort of establishment in London have been praying for these kinds of stories for 5 years. They've had to actually deal with proper politics. They've had to actually leave London, right? And they've had to actually engage with the fact that in this country, it's one person, one vote. They had to address Brexit. They've had to address, potentially Scottish independence. They had to address COVID. They had to address the economic offer of Jeremy Corbyn. And these are actually big political questions. Climate change with XR and, Greta Thunberg and all that stuff. They've had to address really big questions. What they all wanted to do was to go back to the SW1 inside baseball. He said, she said, I want to talk about wallpaper. You want to talk about somebody being somebody's best friend, and they did that and they shouldn't have done. Nobody cares. But this is what they've all been praying for, because this is what they think is political journalism, right? And it's not. Most of the country doesn't care. But they are just so happy they no longer have to actually cover important stories of historical significance. They're chuffed.
I don't think it's quite... I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I don't think it's quite fair to just say it's just about wallpaper, because the issue here is obviously the relationship between business and politics. It's not just about wallpaper, is it? It's saying if you are an MP or a prime minister who's willing to accept money here, there, and everywhere from businesses without reporting it, without declaring it, then that will affect your decision-making, decision-making processes, as we saw that it did so much during the COVID-19 pandemic when they gave out contracts to people who'd given them a bit of money or who had their WhatsApp number. So I think to say it's just about wallpaper is not correct fundamentally.
No, Michael, I think, but he did, no, because now, look, he did pay. Nobody's now saying that Boris Johnson didn't pay for this redecoration. He did pay. And then you get, well, actually, you're going to have to explain this. Oh, no, he did pay, but actually originally somebody else paid and now he's paid. So, well, he's paid. What's the problem? I think it's, Michael.
But this is silly because he only paid once difficult questions were asked about it.
Yeah.
He paid the money back.
We should be careful.
We
don't know that. We don't know that, but that's what it seems. Yeah, that's what it appears. We should be careful.
So, but I mean, I just feel like I feel you can say that this isn't the most important story in the country without just completely buying Boris Johnson's explanation.
I'm not buying it, Michael. No, I'm saying it's an important thing. It shouldn't. And to be fair to Stummer, he didn't lead with it at PMQs. He led with the comment about the bodies piling up. But we're not talking about that story. We're talking about the wallpaper story. And I think the bodies piling up and how that relates to COVID, and like you say, the corruption thing around COVID and Greensill, these are all hugely substantive stories. But I do feel like the media, they all want to report the same thing, and they've all clearly got it in for Carrie Simmons, clearly, and they all like the whole Dom Cummings versus Boris kind of dynamic because it's very SW1, very Westminster, and so this is a story that they love. And so all of a sudden, the rest of us go, "This is a really important story. The wallpaper story is a really important story." I mean, it's an important story.
But you would do it a disservice by calling it. I mean, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I just think by calling it the wallpaper story, you do it a disservice because actually the story is Boris Johnson is willing to accept money without declaring it from business people who are quite likely to get contracts from the government in the future. So, I mean, that is an issue in terms of how you see your job. Do you see your job as one where you are able to get personal gain and help your buddies?
It's a story, but Michael, we're dealing. I mean, anybody who's watching this, who's been watching the Conservatives for the last year, knows that in terms of all the Tory stories with regards to COVID, this is like number 2025. Greensill was huge. Do you know who's the happiest man in Britain after the last week? David Cameron. David Cameron. He was implicated in Greensill is facing criminal prosecution in Germany. This is really serious stuff. A former prime minister was found to be doing really dodgy stuff. Rishi Sunak as well is chuffed to bits, right? You had people at the top of the civil service. We were talking about a huge investigation inquiry into the civil service, people wearing two hats, earning a wage both at the civil service at the same time with the conflict of interest, working for Greensill, like really unbelievable stories and actually of huge importance. And that's all gone to the side because we're talking about wallpaper. I think the happiest man right now is David Cameron. Second is Boris Johnson.
Well, I suppose maybe what this conversation is showing is why it was silly for Keir Starmer to go to John Lewis and look at wallpaper, because I don't think this is just a wallpaper story. The Tories want you to think it's a wallpaper story. But again, I don't think it's the most important political story in the country right now. Let's end the section by very quickly looking at Westminster voting intention. We're not going to get too much into guessing who's going to perform well. We'll see what happens. At the moment, YouGov have the Conservatives on 44%, Labour on 33%. That's down 1. The Lib Dems on 7%, which is up 2. The Greens on 7%, and the SNP on 4%, which is down 1. Although, I mean, obviously their percentage only matters in Scotland, which we'll be discussing in a moment. Reform UK on 3% there to end or to have completeness in our description of those data. In terms of whether the public do care, there was an interesting couple of paragraphs about this in the Times write-up of that YouGov survey. They write, the Tories' overall lead comes despite more than half of the respondents agreeing that the Tories are very sleazy and disreputable, and almost a third saying that they consider Johnson to be less honest than other politicians. Half of voters think that Johnson did say he would rather see bodies pile high than put England into a third lockdown, despite his strenuous denials, with a quarter believing him. Only a third of those polled said they believed that if he did make the comment, it would tell us something about how little he valued saving people. Half said it was probably his way of expressing his reluctance to implement another lockdown. So you can see there, people both think Boris Johnson is dishonest and sleazy, but are very, very willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, which is why, and I think Keir Starmer will be very disappointed with this, actually, according to YouGov, Boris Johnson's favourability ratings are staying fairly steady while Keir Starmer's are declining. So in the past week, that's what you can see. Boris Johnson now has a higher personal rating than Keir Starmer, who's plummeted despite all the scandals involving Boris Johnson and not Keir Starmer. Let's move on to Scotland, just because I know we've got a brilliant guest waiting. The most interesting contest on the 6th of May, and the one that will be most consequential, are elections to the Scottish Parliament. The big story here is whether or not Nicola Sturgeon can win an absolute majority, which she says would serve as a mandate for planning for a second referendum on Scottish independence. So will she get it? It looks like it'll be a close run thing. And we can go to the latest projection from Britain Elects that came out today. They do those in conjunction with the New Statesman, and that puts the SNP on 62 MSPs, just short of the 65 needed for an absolute majority. That poll also suggests that the Greens, who also back independence, could double their representation in Holyrood from 6 to 11. So obviously, even if the SNP don't get that absolute majority, there will be an absolute majority for an Indie Ref 2. Now, to find out what the Scottish Greens will do if they become kingmakers in the next Scottish Parliament, I'm joined by Ross Greer, a member of the Scottish Parliament with the Scottish Greens. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Now, current polling suggests that in practical terms, the next government could be a lot like the last. You'll have an SNP minority government with the Greens sort of propping it up, essentially voting through their budgets. I suppose potentially you could also join a formal coalition with them. My question for you, though, is, at the moment you've got SNP government supported by the Greens. You're about to have probably SNP government supported by the Greens. Is a vote for the Greens a vote for the status quo?
Well, I mean, from our perspective, you just need to look at what we've been able to do with that position of influence over the last 5 years. And it's worth saying, yes, we've agreed, budget deals with the SNP, most notably, each one of the last 5 budgets. They do vote with the Conservatives in the Scottish Parliament just about as much as they vote with the Greens. So particularly on issues like housing, the SNP and the Conservatives are always very keen to defend landlords, whereas you see the Greens and to an extent Labour standing up for tenants. What we've done over the last 5 years, though, with the budgets, we've been able to introduce stuff like free school meals for all primary pupils. So that'll be coming in over the next year, because that was our price of this year's budget. Free bus travel for everyone under the age of 22. About £500 million back into our local government budgets. And stuff like the Green Party rewrote the income tax system in Scotland. So income tax was devolved for the first time after the 2016 election. And one of our prices, I think it was the 2018 budget, was that the income tax system be rewritten so the richest people, the highest earners, pay more, and those on the lowest incomes actually got a small tax cut. So you've seen the influence that we've been able to have over the last 5 years. It's not been on every issue. On other issues, the government can count on other parties' support where they want to preserve the status quo. Where we've been able to really make a mark has been on issues where other parties, frankly, wouldn't work with them.
I mean, the controversy with the Greens' role, as far as I understand it, is, I suppose, voting for budgets which put through quite severe cuts to local councils. So this is Labour Party research, reported by the Herald, which suggests that £937 million in cuts have been made to local government over the past 8 years. Obviously, only four of those years you were supporting the government. Is there anything you think the Greens could have done differently? Could you have played a harder bargain in trying to limit those cuts to local government?
I think we definitely got better at negotiating year by year. So you can see that the last couple of budgets where we got stuff like free bus travel for young people, free school meals, direct cash payments for low-income families this year. So they'll be coming in June, August and December because we put them into the budget. Yeah, we've got better at it than we were in the first couple, but Labour will deliberately use longer periods of time because that's the period of time, half of those budgets, the SNP was in majority and passed them themselves. What we've done over the last 4 years is essentially stop the bleeding. Local government was being hammered. For the last couple of years, it's not been. I wouldn't for a moment suggest that the Greens have reversed all the austerity that local government has suffered between 2010 and 2016 when we started holding the balance of power. But we put £500 million back in, which in Scottish terms is pretty significant. And it stopped the massive austerity that was happening up until that point. Yet we need far more fundamental change. I mean, we like the haggling that we do over a couple £100 million every year doesn't fundamentally solve the problem of local government finance. Council tax rates in Scotland were last set in 1992. I wasn't born in 1992, so we have members of parliament who are fiddling around the edges of a local government tax system that is older than I am. Most people don't even pay the right rate of council tax. And trying to get not just the SNP, but Labour and others on board with that more fundamental reform, the really transformational stuff that the Greens want, that's been what's challenging. So we've done the best we can with the position of influence we had. I think for 5 or 6 MSPs, we've punched above our weight. We're proud of what we've done. Would it have been different if it had been a Green majority government? Of course it would have been. These weren't Green budgets. They were SNP budgets that we were able to really significantly influence. Compare and contrast that with Labour, whose strategy in budget negotiations was to try and force the SNP into a corner where they could only do a deal with the Tories, and it would be a really bad budget, and Labour could turn around and say, see, we told you they were just the tartan Tories all along. We never wanted to cooperate with that kind of strategy because people suffer as a result of that. Those aren't good budgets for public services. They would have been, even worse for our councils. So Labour's strategy was never to get a good budget. It was to, for political opportunism reasons, deliberately force the SNP to pass worse budgets for their own electoral advantage.
There are some uncertainties when it comes to this election, but it looks pretty certain that there is going to be a majority for a second Indy ref, a second referendum for Scottish independence after the elections on the 6th of May. What's your position on what should happen next, how that should happen? I mean, we can presume Boris Johnson is in power in Westminster. He's not going to say, yeah, go on, have the referendum. Do you think they should go and do, I suppose, an illegal referendum where you just organise it without the support of the Westminster government?
The kind of trite answer to this, I suppose, is that I don't want to live in exile in Belgium, and you just need to look at the experience of our friends in Catalonia to see that that's not a path to independence. There are avenues that are available to us, though, but most interestingly has been the briefings that have come out of Downing Street and the Tories over the last couple of weeks, that instead of this hardline position of opposition, you can never have a referendum even if you voted for it, they're beginning to recognise that that's actually just pushing more people towards the independence cause because it's validating our argument about the democratic deficit. So what the briefing now is that they might try and bounce us into an early referendum and to try and have it really quickly. And they think the no side, the unionist side, believe that they would stand a better chance of winning if we've not had a chance to prepare our post-pandemic, our post-COVID argument for independence. So we're seeing a shift in their tactics, which I welcome because it's obviously to a slightly more democratic or a slightly less anti-democratic position. But we don't actually have any legal precedent on this in Scotland. So it's never been tested. The case for whether or not the Scottish Parliament actually has the power to hold a referendum, it's never been tested in court. So if we end up in that situation where we've won the pro-independence majority that it looks like we're going to, the Scottish Parliament has passed a resolution saying there should be a referendum. If the UK government reject the Section 30 order that's required to do it in what would be constitutionally an unquestionably legitimate manner, if they reject that, we can go to court and test the case on whether or not the Scottish Parliament actually has the power to do this itself, because that's not settled and there's strong legal opinion on both sides of that particular debate. So we've got legal avenues that are available to us, though obviously that wouldn't be the preferred path. We would prefer that the other side simply recognise the democratic legitimacy of the mandate we'll win.
And what about independence in general, the arguments for it, and especially, I suppose, the position of the Greens? Because as far as I understand it, what you guys want is to leave the UK and immediately join the EU. And as well as there being a lot of currency issues, which were exactly the same issues that arose in Indy Ref 1 in 2014, you now have this massive issue of the border. And we've seen what happened in Northern Ireland. It was very difficult. They also had the Good Friday Agreement. So there was, I suppose, a necessity for both sides to have an arrangement whereby you could have a bit of a soft border on the island of Ireland. How, if an independent Scotland joins the EU and the rest of the UK still has a fairly hard Brexit situation with the European Union, are you not going to have a hard border between England and Scotland where people have to have checks before they can cross that border, or at least goods will have to have checks before they can cross that border?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to stand here and pretend that there's a straightforward answer to that, but we wouldn't claim that an independent Scotland would be, joining the EU instantaneously. That's a process. Now, we would be better placed than most countries that start the accession process for joining, because at the moment, obviously, we abide by most of the acquis, because until very recently we're bound by them as part of a member state. The discussion around that is in a totally different place to what it was in 2014, and obviously where we've been gradually moving to since 2016. It would be in absolutely no one's interest to have a hard border between Scotland and England. It is notably different to Northern Ireland. So I sit on one of the bodies that monitors the Good Friday Agreement. Obviously, we're in wildly different places. For us, it's not a conflict-related situation, but it would be incredibly bad economics, obviously, to be setting up a hard border. The process by which Scotland can move back in towards the European Union, and the process by which we become independent and avoid a hard border, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. I mean, no one is suggesting that the common travel area would end, for example, and we're not suggesting that overnight these issues are easy to solve. But what we're asking for here is the opportunity to have that debate. So we want an opportunity. We've not set out our detailed prospectus for how independence would look like on day one, because we've not yet won the mandate to have that referendum. That's what this election is all about. And we recognise the plans that were there in 2014, they don't apply anymore to quite a significant extent on both sides. Both sides' arguments have completely changed since 2014. What we as a country deserve is the opportunity to have this debate and to thrash out exactly how that would work. And for those of us who are pro-EU and believe Scotland's future should be in the European Union, that requires a different case to the one that existed in 2014. And we need the time, the opportunity to actually build up and develop that case. What we're trying to do between now and Thursday is the pre-debate, the pre-argument, the debate about whether or not we should even have this debate. Should Scotland have another opportunity at self-determination? And clearly it looks like we're heading towards a majority for that, at least. Once you get to what independence looks like, that's when there are much, much sharper divisions, because the Greens, as a party of the radical left, we want something quite fundamentally different from the SNP. So it's not just that we want something different from what our friends on the unionist side would argue for. Our vision of independence is of complete social and economic transformation. The SNP's, I would argue, is the status quo in Edinburgh, but rather than London. Those debates are debates that we can only have if we are having a referendum and then actually become independent. At the moment, it's all kind of theoretical and academic, where all we're asking for is the opportunity to actually have that argument, have that debate about self-determination.
Well, for purely selfish reasons, I would like there to be a second Indie referendum, so you can come back on and we can hash it out when it comes to borders and currencies and all those incredibly interesting issues. Ross Greer, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Michael.
Let's go straight on to our next story. Jon Snow, the host of Channel 4 News for the past 32 years, this week announced he would be retiring from the show at the end of this year. Now, before becoming the presenter of the show, Snow spent 11 years as an ITN correspondent, first on an assignment in Vietnam, then as Washington correspondent between 1983 and 1986, and finally as diplomatic editor between 1986 and 1989. Since then, of course, he's been the host of the whole show. Now, announcing his departure, Channel 4 put out this collection of clips from his time at the organisation.
Good evening. Mr. President, we're live on British television news now.
Dominate the people of England.
We've been pinned down by incoming Iranian fire. What has happened to these people will happen to you. The investigation into what went wrong has an added urgency. Hello, good evening.
An extraordinary atmosphere.
Welcome to ITN's Election 92. What a night.
Apartheid committed so many crimes.
Let bygones be bygones.
You really feel something here that it's very difficult to describe. You do feel that people died here.
The answer to that question is no.
We don't know. The answer to that question is we do not know.
I'm here in Haiti after the shattering earthquake that killed so many.
How far are you going? I see. Yeah, we're
I'll keep going until you tell me to stop.
So
overwhelming. Geriatrics, people with paralysis. What was the point of bombing the El Wafa hospital, for goodness sake?
Streaming up onto the freeway from the two most populous districts in New Orleans. It's 8 o'clock, and the night commuters are arriving at La Chour Hospital in Goulou, not one of whom has ever known a bed at home.
Totally random. I already speaks it, innit? One form of the English language.
Very lovely to meet you, Jon Snow.
You know nothing.
You bastard.
Differences in the way that skunk and hash affect brain activity. This was aggressive film.
No, at times that was a slightly saccharine video, but he's clearly had quite an extraordinary career. Also quite an interesting guy. I only learned today that in 1970, Jon Snow was expelled from Liverpool University for taking part in an occupation protesting connections between the university and the apartheid regime in South Africa. He did go on to accept an honorary degree at the university, but used his speech to call the previous uni bosses monsters and loonies. So he's a guy that cares. That's what's been coming out from social media over the past 24 hours on learning the news. But what is Jon Snow like to work with? Earlier today, I spoke with Paul Mason, who worked as culture editor and then economics editor at Channel 4 News between 2013 and 2016. I started by asking Paul how Jon Snow compared to other anchors he's worked alongside over the years.
The importance of what he did and some of those viral videos. I mean, I remember one really clearly was the Gaza video. Even though people walk up to me in the street because of a video I made outside RBS at the height of the world financial crisis. And I was just going crazy because I was sick of being harassed by security guards outside banks that had gone bust. And I kept saying to them, look, if only you would just turn around and look inside the bank, you'll find some criminals. The reason I did that, and the reason Jon Snow did the Gaza video, is we were actually told, so Ofcom, the regulator, was saying to TV programs, you're losing connection with your audience, you've got no emotional connection, you need to sound like you care. So Snow booked, somehow, the Channel 4 studio and did a YouTube-only video in support of the Gaza appeal while the Gaza war was going on. Both my experiment and his experiment, his was bigger, in trying to be emotionally connected, backfired. And the whole ton of bricks, that's the polite word for it, came down on Channel 4 because of that video, because Snow had actually said, look, I care about the child victims. Snow and others like him are part of the elite. They are absolutely part of the upper 2% of British society. But they actually care. They actually care about the victims of capitalism and war, and wanted to show it. They were no longer actually satisfied, just as I wasn't, with simply saying, on the one hand, on the other, so many dead people. We name them and talk about their children if they're from one side. We treat them as faceless nothings if they're from another side. I know because I work with him that Jon Snow really wanted to break free of that type of journalism, which is what we get from the BBC most of the time. Every morning, you have a meeting at 9 o'clock, and it's an intense meeting, at 9 a.m., and everybody's there, sitting there. They've all got off their bikes. They're all sweating. They're all ready to go. And you want to discuss the news, what we're going to do. And everybody has a go at each other. It's a tense meeting. Snow walked in with a homeless young man who he'd found on the street outside. And he said, I'm the chair of a homeless charity. And what am I supposed to do? Leave this guy outside. And so several people who should have been then doing the kind of macho kind of news meeting, had to put down what they were doing and find this young guy a place to live. I don't think I would have done that. I don't think most people would have done that. But I think he had the kind of social footprint and level of conscience where he would do something like that. And I think that, that's what, it's that attitude, isn't it? It's that, I'm not going to swear on Novara, but it's up yours attitude that so many journalists don't have anymore.
Now, at the start of that clip, Paul Mason was talking about some of the viral videos of Jon Snow really speaking like he cares. He mentioned a video about Gaza. I really recommend you look that up on YouTube. Actually, very, very powerful. He's talking about the horrific effects of the Israeli invasion of Gaza back in 2014. Another clip of him which has gone viral since this news was announced, was him talking about another issue which was clearly close to his heart, which was the fire at Grenfell. Let's take a look at this clip from a lecture he gave.
I'm still haunted too by my own link with what happened at Grenfell Tower. On the 20th of April this year, I was involved with Bill Gates in judging a schools debate, a competition in London. It was the final of a countrywide championship organised by the charity DebateMate. That's an organisation that does fantastic work democratising that skill so often associated with the elite, public speaking. I was there to judge the best floor speech. I had little difficulty in deciding. The winner, Firdaus Kadir, remarkably poised, hijab-wearing 12-year-old from West London. She was confident. She used language beautifully. Bill Gates grasped her hand and gave her the award. On the 19th of June, a mere 2 months later, reporting from Grenfell, I spotted a picture of Firdaus on a missing poster. She and her entire family of 5 are believed to have been incinerated together on the 22nd floor of Grenfell Tower. 2 weeks ago, it was confirmed that remnants of Firdaus and her father had indeed been found in their flat and that their identities had been confirmed using DNA. Firdaus had been described as the most intelligent, wise, eloquent girl. I was fortunate to witness that firsthand, and since then I often think, what might have she become? What were her life chances once she'd been picked out in this way? Could she have prevailed over the fractures in our society and succeeded? Britain is not alone in this. Our organic links with our own society are badly broken, in part because the echelons from which our media is drawn do not, for the most part, fully reflect the population amongst whom we live and to whom we seek to transmit information and ideas. Grenfell speaks to us all about our own lack of diversity and capacity to reach into the swathes of Western society with whom we have no connection. Like my fellow journalists, I have spent many hours around Grenfell. I've come to know a number of the survivors, and I speak to them regularly by phone or email. So casually written off as nameless migrants, scroungers, illegals, and the rest. Actually, and it should be no shock to us, the tower was full of talent, not least the wonderful and talented Khadija Sayed, who died with her mother on the verge of a major breakthrough as an artist. Or community leaders like Eddie DeFarm, who survived the inferno, but who wrote that warning blog on October the 20th, 2016. We, the media, report the lack of diversity in other walks of life, but our own record is nothing like good enough.
A really moving speech there. Actually, some of the themes that Paul Mason raised there, I think, coming through, especially this idea about, diversity, the media needing to understand what's going on in the real world. I think the idea of, him seeing a homeless person outside of Channel 4 News and saying, I need to bring them in and you can sort out housing to them, to his team. I said to Paul actually after that, if Laura Kuenssberg had to sort out someone who was struggling with their benefits every year, she'd probably have a much better understanding of politics than she does just from reading WhatsApp messages from the various elites in Westminster. Aaron, you mentioned before that political journalists tend to be too obsessed with the he sheds and the she saids of Westminster. When Jon Snow leaves Channel 4 News at the end of the year, will we be in an even more, I suppose, worse situation when it comes to obsessions with Westminster bubble? Is he one of the few news anchors who's able to break out of it?
Yeah, and I think him leaving the media is a huge moment, actually, Michael, particularly broadcast media, because of course people are doing interesting, innovative, progressive stuff outside of legacy media, but actually in print and broadcast, good people are few and far between. And I think for me, what Jon Snow embodies are two sort of core traits which have kind of disappeared from the British establishment. And Paul was very right to say, look, he was not an anti-establishment figure. This type, actually, you see them quite frequently in sort of British society over the last 100 years, in the democratic era. Firstly, he was he believed in being a responsible liberal patrician. He believed that, he had responsibilities to society, and he believed that there were things that brought us together, and he believed in something, right? He believed in something. He believed in things beyond just the market mechanism, beyond profit, beyond money, beyond opportunism. And he believed in the truth as a journalist. And of course, all journalists will say that. But I think his record, like you say, probably, I think, stands a bit taller than some others. Then secondly, I think he believed in his profession. I think he believed in the importance of journalism as a public service. You can't have democracy without an informed general public. And that requires objective, at best, journalism. That requires those people being well informed. And you can't merely have journalism as an outgrowth of lobbying, political representation, public relations. You have to have something independent of that. And the reality is, Michael, there are very few journalists that still believe that. Extraordinarily few people. I don't think Robert Peston believes it. I don't think Laura Kuenssberg believes it. I don't think people at the top, and of course there are many people at the bottom of the media who do think that, but people at the top, and Jon Snow was one of those, generally don't think that. And that's why his loss is going to be a real hit, because he believed in an idea of public service. He believed in, journalists being an integral feature to a democratic society. And my goodness, compare that speech he just gave, Michael, to the fact that Andrew Marr launched his novel in number 10 Downing Street. This is somebody who viewed themselves as relating to society in a profoundly different way to a Laura Kuenssberg or an Andrew Marr. And his loss is all the more sad for it. His loss to his profession, I should say. He's not passed away.
He's not dead. You used the past tense a fair few times. He's working till the end of the year. He's very much alive and well.
No,
but I take all your points.
He's not participating in public life in the same way. He's been on people's TV screens pretty much every day for decades, and that's gone. And that is a loss. And it's important to say that.
Yeah. Next year will be the first time in my lifetime that someone else will host Channel 4 News. He started hosting it the year I was born. Let's go to a comment. $10 donation from Lost in the Fog of War. Cheers from across the pond. They tell me I was born there, but I really don't remember. I don't get the reference. I hate it when this happens. But anyway, thank you so much for the comment. If you're enjoying the video, do hit the like button. The next story is kind of related to the last one. All the worst parts of journalism Aaron was just talking about. The Greensill scandal has shone a light on the revolving door that exists between politics and big business, with powerful individuals, including ex-prime ministers, moving seamlessly between making public policy decisions and then lobbying for corporations which shape those decisions. The relationship damages government not only because well-paid ex-politicians mobilize their connections, but also because when politicians are still in office, they have an incentive to be soft on those corporations who might employ them afterwards. The whole thing, as we've seen with David Cameron and the Greensill scandal, it stinks. But, and this is important, the revolving door between lobbyists and politicians is not the only one at the heart of the British establishment. That's because there's another revolving door which receives less scrutiny from the media because it involves the media. It involves journalists themselves. And we have a couple of examples of this just from this week. In a period of sort of 24 hours, you've got two key examples of this revolving door. Now, the first is Alastair Campbell. You'll have heard of him, former spin doctor to Tony Blair, and before that, political editor at The Mirror. Campbell is, of course, most famous for his key role in selling the disastrous war in Iraq to the British public. And Campbell has now bagged a new gig as guest host of Good Morning Britain. So going from director of communications in Downing Street to one of the most high-profile political hosts on morning television. For now, it's only for a week. I think they're probably testing him out to see if he gets the job permanently. I don't know. That's my suspicion. But that's what could happen next. He said, for what it's worth, he doesn't want to be the next Piers Morgan. However, he did speak in very glowing terms about Piers Morgan's role at the show, although I suppose complimenting him for one aspect of journalism that we have as well, which is he can be quite good at holding politicians to account. So of Piers Morgan, Alastair Campbell wrote, one of the most important elements of our democracy is that ministers and their shadows should be subject to scrutiny and questioning, and I thought it was self-defeating for the government to have their long boycott of certain programmes, including Good Morning Britain. Ministers should never fear robust questioning, but I also know how much most people hate it when things descend into squabbling and shouting, and though I may have strong views, I also think one of the worst things about the nature of our debate, exacerbated by social media, is that we don't want to engage properly with people who have different views. Another one of those people talking about, civility is so important in politics when you're someone who lied to go into an illegal war. Anyway, straight from a disgraced role in number 10 Downing Street to one of the most prominent positions on our TV screens. Make of that what you will. Our second example of this revolving door concerns Robbie Gibb. Robbie Gibb, slightly less famous than Alastair Campbell, but potentially just as influential. He is the brother of a Tory minister, for a start. That's not the main part of the story, though, surprisingly. He also had a 25-year career at the BBC when he was head of the corporation's political programming until 2017. Now, following the general election that year, he became Theresa May's Director of Communications at Downing Street. So straight from the BBC to Director of Communications at Downing Street. Interesting, the same job that Alastair Campbell had. And now, straight back to the BBC. Yeah, you can just do it like BBC, number 10, BBC. That's what's happened here, because he's been announced as taking up a 3-year paid role as England representative on the BBC board. Now, the BBC board, incredibly powerful, influential organisation. It's made up of 14 people, 5 of whom are appointed by the government. The other 9 are co-opted by the board's existing members. Gibb is one of the government appointees. Now, that board has responsibilities including setting the strategic direction of the corporation, the creative remit for its output, and its budget. Incredibly important, as you'd expect a board to be. Now, there's been a fair amount of analysis about this. As I say, journalists don't tend to write about the revolving door between government and media, or at least not suggest it might be problematic, because lots of them are thinking, maybe I'll go and do that in a moment anyway. I mean, they don't want to seem hypocritical. But there was some interesting analysis of this in the BBC. So this was from their media editor, Amal Rajan, writing up the story and an analysis of it. He writes, while critical, Sir Robbie has been consistently supportive of a reformed BBC, arguing publicly and privately that it is a national jewel that urgently needs to address its disconnect with conservative and non-metropolitan audiences. Interestingly, he backs the principle of universality behind the licence fee, even if the practicalities of how the fee operates may need to evolve. His appointment clearly strengthens the BBC's links, not just with Westminster, but with the Conservative Party specifically. It goes on, earlier this year, Richard Sharp replaced Sir David Clementi as the BBC's chairman. Sharp, a former banker, investor and philanthropist, is close to Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, who he worked with during the pandemic. Sunak previously worked with Sharp at Goldman Sachs. So there you have it in black and white. I mean, he's supposed to be objective, so we can't say this is an outrage. But you've got the chairman of the BBC, very close to Rishi Sunak. They've just appointed someone else to the BBC, to the board, who is even closer with the Conservative Party, worked for them in one of the most important jobs in the Conservative Party, straight back into the BBC. The board, as it happens, also going to oversee his impartiality. Part of his job will be to say, oh, that seems a bit biased. You were literally the chief advisor to Theresa May. Aaron, I want to bring you in on this, on both the Alastair Campbell gig and the Robbie Gibb gig. I think the Robbie Gibb, well, it's very difficult to say. Robbie Gibb's new job, let's stop saying gig, is potentially more outrageous. The idea that you can just go straight from the BBC, Westminster, BBC. He could presumably after this go and work for another Tory Prime Minister and just keep doing this flip-flopping between the two.
Yeah, no, I think there's two deeply separate stories here, right? Although, of course, it's the same sort of big one, which is, the revolving door. Alastair Campbell, though, I think in many ways, Michael, is much worse. Because, what we're being told right now by the Labour leadership, by, a bunch of people, including the Conservatives, they are saying that, yes, what should happen is that there should be consequences for doing bad things when you're in public life. There should be consequences for that. Alastair Campbell was in an operation at Downing Street working for Tony Blair, which lied to the cabinet, parliament, and the country about entering an illegal war with absolutely no evidence or basis to do so. None at all. None at all. There were several people around Blair who, like I say, I'll happily say this, actively lied and deceived and misrepresented the situation to their colleagues in the cabinet, to their own party, and to the public. And what are the consequences of that? You know, you might think that Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson are terrible people. Believe me, they have done nothing compared to that. Nothing. They lied to start this war, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. It destabilized the Middle East probably for another 50, 60, 70 years. Who knows? Which gave, which gave the conditions which allowed for the rise of ISIS. And this man, the consequences he's facing is hosting a morning chat show on ITV. Where are the consequences? People say there should be consequences for Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson. Where are the consequences for Alastair Campbell? There are no consequences. And I think, again, we were talking about Jon Snow a second ago, Michael. It goes back to this idea that there is no ethos of public service, or duty, or responsibility, or actually consequences. I've done something bad. I should face the consequences. You know, the Blairites love to talk about law and order, and if you're going to have rights, you should also have responsibilities. What were their responsibilities? You're given so much power. British soldiers have lost their lives, private contractors, Iraqi citizens, and over the course of 20 years, what consequences are there for that, for what you did? There are none. To this day, they won't apologize for it. They won't even apologize for it, Michael. Almost 2 decades later, they won't even apologize for it. So I find it remarkable, this man who saw his entire, not his job, his entire being as media management, as seeing the media effectively as an outgrowth of political communications. That was his job, and he perfected it more than anyone else. He's now talking about, I'm going to hold politicians accountable. Bullshit. He's the absolute worst person who should have that job. And what's more, Michael, I find it just from a commercial perspective very strange. I mean, he's an old guy. He's like 60. You know, I mean, maybe, and this is what I find interesting, is maybe broadcasters now just given up on young people. When I say young, I mean like under 45s. I think they've just given up. You know, what person? I thought they could have gone for a younger person here. And like you said, it's just a trial. Get a really exciting. When I say young, I mean like a 40-year-old, Michael. I don't mean like somebody who is like a teenager or a student. So on that level, it's interesting. But I just think, my God, Alastair Campbell at GMB hosting it embodies the moral degradation of British public life and politics and the media. It's so corroded morally, it's almost unbelievable. The Robbie Gibb thing is slightly different in so much as the BBC, it holds itself up to such high service with public service journalism. And like you say, this guy, he's done it once, maybe he'll do it again. Maybe we're just like this Polybian cycle of Robbie Gibb, politics, media, politics, media, politics, media. Maybe that's what he'll do. He's got his brother's a Tory MP. I mean, and there's no consequences. And so even the BBC, which is meant to embody all the highest, probity and public life and high standards and professionalism and world class, it's all bullshit. It's all crap that the establishment in this country tell themselves. Where's the probity? At least give it a few years, right? At least give it 5 years. They can't even do that. Probably because I don't know, is the paycheck too good? Is the status, is he missed the status? Does he miss being at the center of attention? Probably.
Well, what's striking about it, I find, is, and this goes back to the whole Boris Johnson's flat refurb thing, is that when it comes to this issue, Laura Kuenssberg does, at least go on the television and say the reason this matters is because if Boris Johnson is paid this money by this business person, then when he's making decisions, he might take that into account, right? She gives this very basic explanation as to why this would be a problem. I've never heard her, or to be honest, any political journalist saying the reason it's a problem for people to go from working in a job where they're supposed to hold the government to account to then immediately working for those same politicians is we might think that means they go soft on those politicians. And the reason we think it's a problem to have political editors of the BBC working as director of communication is that then they'll be friends with precisely the people who are supposed to hold that person to account. So you end up with this very cozy in club where no one really has an adversarial relationship with each other because they're all essentially colleagues. I've never heard that spelled out like that.
And Michael, it's the worst of all worlds because Britain, London has such a huge role in our national conversation. We have a two-party system. So the centralizing sort of powers here, ultimately it means that several hundred people in this country define what matters and what doesn't in terms of the media conversation. Robbie Gibb's one of them. Maybe at a push 1,000. That is not. This is a country of 68 million. It's the fifth, sixth largest economy in the world. That's not how things are meant to function, right? And this is a major problem. And again, everybody knows this. It's one of those, it makes, that's why it's one of those moments where you feel like we're in the kind of 1980s Soviet Union. Everybody knows you're not meant to do this. Everybody knows this isn't really public service journalism. Everybody knows you don't really have any sense of an ethos of public service, of obligation. This is just basically about looking out for number one and your sort of your political preferences and party political kind of factions, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody knows that's what this is about. Nobody says it, and they dress it up in all this kind of, regal language and professionalism and diligence. And he's one of the very few people in British media that was like that was Jon Snow. Robbie Gibb, my God, the polar opposite. And the fact they've not even tried to conceal it, Michael. It's just so brazen. It's almost like they want to wind people up. Robbie goes like, I'm going to apply for this, put it out there. Let's see this blow up on Twitter. Yeah, fuck them. Excuse my French, but that's all I can think. It's remarkable. It's almost like they're mocking us. And I'm not saying this to YouTube outrage. I mean, it does feel like they're mocking us. Right? Alastair Campbell on Good Morning Britain, and then Robbie Gibb's allowed to go back to the BBC. Come on. Try some new people. Try some people who aren't only interested in filling their own pockets and looking out for their own side, their own political football team. Try that. Who knows? We might not have 15 years of flatlining wages and falling home ownership and rising homelessness and people living in tents on roundabouts. Hey, maybe something might change.
Yeah, very well put. Very well put, Aaron. I agree with you 100% on that. I do think they're taking the piss of us. They're taking the piss out of us with the Robbie Gibb job. I feel like if you leave the media to politics, that should be taboo and you should not be allowed back. We're going to end very soon. Just to finish off, we have an update for a story we did on Wednesday. So on Wednesday's show, we discussed Joe Rogan's terrible advice on COVID vaccines. If you weren't watching, he said that young and healthy people shouldn't get vaccinated because they're not vulnerable. Now, we thought it's only fair to give you an update as he has responded to the many people who criticized him for the comments. So we should point out that Rogan has since rode back on his comments about vaccines. So clarifying his views on vaccines, he said, "I'm not an anti-vax person," and added, "I said I believe they are safe and I encourage many people to take them. I just said that if you're a healthy young person, you don't need it. Their argument was you need it for other people. And yes, that makes sense." So yes, he's admitted the error. That was precisely the criticism we had of him, is to say that you didn't take into account that getting vaccinated isn't just for yourself. Someone has pointed that out. He said, okay, fair play. That was fair enough. The issue here is you've already done a podcast which streams to millions and millions of people around the world and millions of people who are considering whether or not to get a vaccine. And this is, in some areas of life, I actually respect it when people, they're like, it's not the end of the world if I get something wrong. Let's just speak openly and honestly. And if something's, if I need to correct my mistake, I'll do that in the future. I think on some issues, that's fine, right? Especially if you don't put yourself forward as a news presenter, you put yourself forward as an open-minded podcast host. When it comes to the issue of vaccines, the issue that's going to get us out of this pandemic, where the personal choice of each of your viewers is incredibly important, you have to do this research first. You just have to, especially as it's not even that fucking complicated, right? Like even the most basic level of professionalism means that you don't talk about vaccines in a ridiculous way and tell people not to take them unless you've properly researched the argument. And this apology, whilst it's, it's good that it's come, shows that he hadn't even considered, right, that you might be taking the vaccines for other people, which means he hasn't done the most basic element of research here. I mean, that's all I'm going to say about Joe Rogan. Just to close it out, let's take a look at a clip of Joe Rogan speaking in response to the criticism.
These are not like planned statements. Let's be real clear. Yeah. When I say something stupid, I'm not thinking about what I'm going to say before I say it. I'm just saying it, right? I don't have an off-air and on-air voice. I don't. No. I have me. This is it. Yeah. Yeah. I got through the fucking net and I'm swimming in open waters, okay? Yeah. And that's just how I live.
Don't live like that when it comes to vaccines, Joe Rogan. You can live like that on a lot of issues. You can't live like that when it comes to COVID-19, because whether you like it or not, if there are millions of people who listen to your podcast, you have some responsibility. We'll end it there. Aaron, it has been a pleasure spending this Friday evening with you. Have a wonderful weekend. I think we've got 9 days of rain to look forward to.
Oh, my pleasure. I was going to say, Michael, look, it's all right to have an odd opinion about a bicep lock in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, not when it comes to global public health.
Exactly. Very well put. Fox is pointing out, if it is raining, that means you've got no excuse not to stay in for Tysky Sour. So I'm hoping the live views will be up next week, because you're not allowed inside. You're presumably breaking the rules if you're not watching it. Let's end there. Aaron, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure as always. Thank you everyone for watching and for your super chats and for your comments and for your tweets. We'll be back on Monday at 7 p.m. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.